Hello everyone, welcome to the webinar. I'm Lizzie Sagoo, President-elect of the British Society of Soil Science, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our fourth webinar of the year. Before I welcome our presenters, I'd like to introduce the British Society of Soil Science as hosts of today's webinar. We're an established international membership organisation and a charity committed to the study of soil in its widest aspects. We bring together those working within academia, and we've got a growing membership amongst practitioners implementing soil science in industry and those with a keen interest in soils. We plan to host 10 webinars during 2025, so keep an eye out on our website for further details. And before we begin, just some basic housekeeping. As there's so many of you here today, all your microphones have been muted. We will be taking questions during at the end of the presentations, so we'll be monitoring these throughout the webinar. So please submit any questions you've got in the chat box by 12:50 to make sure that we've got time to go through as many as we can. The presentations today have both been awarded BASIS and Naroso CPD points. So if you are registered with either of these, please contact us directly after the event so we can get your points allocated. And finally, please be aware that we're recording today's presentation. So our first presenter today is Professor Leo Condron. Leo is the Editor-in-Chief of the Soil Use and Management Journal, and the journal is marking its 40th anniversary this year. Leo was born in Glasgow and completed a BSc Honours degree in agricultural chemistry at the University of Glasgow before moving to New Zealand to undertake a PhD in soil science at the University of Canterbury. He has over 38 years' experience in academia and research, and his research has predominantly investigated the impacts of land use and management practices on phosphorus and organic matter dynamics in grassland and forest soils, soil chronosequence, biogeochemistry, and relationships between soil microbial diversity and function. Leo has published an impressive over 300 articles to date and has supervised over 120 postgraduate students and postdoctoral fellows. So over to you, Leo.
Thank you, Lizzie. It's a very great pleasure to be here. So I'll be doing two things today in my brief talk, and that is to overview soil use and management. And I took over as the new editor-in-chief in the beginning of December last year. So I've been in the job for 4 months. And one of the first things that I had to do was asked to do by the society was to revise the mission statement. So I think soil use and management really, I mean, somebody used the expression the other day, it really is what it says on the tin, right? It's a very targeted journal in terms of looking at soil use and management. So you can see there on the slide, I'm not going to read it all out, but it's basically encompassing agriculture, environment, and importantly, policy studies. I'll come back a little bit to that later. And the idea is it's going to be novel and significant information about natural and anthropogenic processes that on the function, productivity, health, and sustainability of managed soil systems. And it also takes account of global issues such as climate change, environmental quality, food security, and progress towards specific sustainable development goals. So that's the general or specific mission or objective of the journal. Next slide, please. Thanks. Okay. I'm not going to go through here a little bit, but the reason why I put this slide up was it's between 219 and 224. These are the top sort of cited papers, and it gives you an idea of the sort of issues or the topics that come up: soil acidification, ammonia volatilization, soil microbial inoculants, soil salinity, land information systems, biochar, inoculums, a specific mention of the Sustainable Development Goals, influence of cultivation or tillage, and also farm management and soil carbon and aggregate stability. So it just gives you a bit of an idea of the sort of manuscripts that we publish. Next slide, please, Dominic. Thank you. And again, I'm not going to go into detail here, but again, this just covers the sort of topics. And this is the most cited papers from 2023. And there's just a wide range of not only disciplines or topics, but also different locations around the world, because although we're owned by the British Society of Soil Science, published by Wiley, we are truly, like the European Journal of Soil Science, we are truly an international journal. Next slide, please. No, a nice simple slide. My favorite topic is impact factors, not. But anyway, just the reason why I put this up is that it just goes to show that to illustrate that the impact factor has been growing steadily over the last 4 or 5 years, and that is partly to do with the fact that, next slide please, Dominic, thanks. Yep, it's to do with the number of submissions. And while we took a bit of a dip during the impacts of COVID, I think you can see there that we're on about in 2023, we're on about 570. 2024, we're up to 800. And this year, if we track the way we're going at the moment, and I've got no idea as I'm just new to the position, but we're looking at somewhere between 800 and 1,000 submissions, with around about an acceptance rate of somewhere about 20 to 25%, whatever. But every manuscript is evaluated on its merits. But so it's that partly explains the impact factor a little bit in terms of that the numbers have been growing. If we go back a bit further in time, it was even fewer submissions. Next slide, please, Dominic. Oh, this is, you don't have to read this, but this is my last slide on soil use and management. One of the things I have done since I came on board as the editor is to basically refresh and revise and refresh the editorial board, particularly in relation to the associate editors. So when I came in, there was about 25 or 30 effective associate editors, and thanks to a lot of people who have actually taken up my invitations to become associate editors. So we now there, you can't see the detail on there, I now have effectively 70 associate editors, and we'll need them to cope with the submissions that we have. But a couple of other initiatives I just want to mention is one that we are looking at special collections or special issues, and also commissioned reviewed articles. And many of you will be familiar with the European Journal of Soil Science, who have the review articles, and the prestigious ones of those commissioned reviewed articles are known as Russell reviews. Well, soil use and management has the Alan Wild reviews. Not been a lot. I don't know if there've been any of them actually published, but we'll be reviving that concept and targeting that, and a few other initiatives that we're doing. And just to put a plug in here, if you are interested in becoming an associate editor, email me. There are some areas where we're really interested, where we need to get more associate editors, particularly in relation to policy and regulation as it relates to soil use and management. So if you're interested, please email me. So that's fine. So Dominic, next slide, please. Now I'm going to talk about Pietro is going to give a presentation in a few minutes, but I thought to give him enough time to go through what is an excellent review article, I thought I would just do a little bit of introduction on phosphorus, just to set the scene a little bit, especially for those of you who may not be familiar with phosphorus. So Dominic, next slide, please. People often say, why is phosphorus important? Why is nitrogen important? There's a very simple reason why phosphorus and nitrogen are very important, and it's really about the relative availability in both terrestrial systems and aquatic systems. And phosphorus, relative to what is available in a water environment or in a soil solution to what the plant requires, the ratio for phosphorus is 80,000. So it's not very available. Nitrogen is 30,000. Most of the other nutrients, including micronutrients, are commonly around 1,000 or way less than 500. So that is one of the reasons, a principal reason, why the productivity in managed or natural systems is so dependent on phosphorus. And the distinction between nitrogen and phosphorus is that nitrogen availability and transformations is almost exclusively biologically controlled, other than a little bit of exchange in terms of ammonium. Whereas if we take something like potassium, it's chemically, the availability is chemically driven. Phosphorus is a complex mix of chemistry and biology, and as illustrated in that the diagram there. And because of that, it's partly because of that low availability that in managed systems in particular. Can we go to the next slide, please, Dominic? In managed systems in particular, we need to put phosphorus into these systems to increase production, increase productivity, and maintain it. And this was a slide I found a few years ago, and really impressive. I don't even know the source of it, to be honest, but it just shows you the level of intensity that's happened since the sort of 1940s up to the present day in terms of land use intensity. You've gone from to require 250 kilograms of maize, you've gone from nearly 2,000 square meters basically down to less than 200. But to do that requires large inputs of nutrients, including phosphorus. Next slide, please, Dominic. Yep. And it's no coincidence that that increased intensity is linked to increase in population, and with that comes the demand for phosphorus and therefore the supply of phosphorus. So you can see in this diagram here that basically after the Second World War, we had this to sustain that increase in food production and intensity. There was a big increase, mostly enabled by phosphate rock, by mined phosphate rock, fertilizers derived from phosphate rock. And there's a very important point here, and the 1945 is really important. If you consider the next slide, put into a little bit of context here. Thanks, Dominic. Yep. Okay. The thing about it is that for that period, from about the end of the Second World War through to about 2007, 2008, the actual cost of the raw material, phosphate rock, really didn't vary that much. There were a few spikes, but it was actually relatively stable and very relatively inexpensive as well. Okay, commonly less than $50 a ton. Now, just remember that number for a minute. I'll show you in the next slide. And so what that effectively meant was, as I say, for 50 odd years, 60 years, we had basically cheap phosphorus in the Western world anyway, in parts of Asia and South America. And that encouraged a lot of the use of phosphorus. And the diagram on the top right here is really just an agronomic, well, predominantly an agronomic diagram, where basically the Olsen p-value on the bottom here is a measure of plant available P, a measure of the phosphorus status of the soil. And on the y-axis there on the right and the left-hand side is the relative yield. And what you're aiming for, what we should be aiming for in proper agronomic practice, is around about 75 to 90%. That you want to have your soil at that sort of level. There's lots of other things that influence the productivity, but if you can get it within there, that's there's proven in many different circumstances that is the optimum amount of fertilizer that you need, and that's fine. And if you've got an increasing population, you're increasing production. But if you go into what I mentioned about intensity there, with relatively inexpensive phosphorus, you can actually push it up beyond that 75 to 90%. And you're getting that extra 10%. You're going up to the maximum yield. And there are many other factors in here, but that is one of the factors that has actually driven up the use of phosphorus. And there are consequences for doing that, for putting a lot amount of phosphorus. First of all, phosphorus is immobilized in the soil. mainly by absorption onto iron and aluminium oxides. And that is a cost that you pay for putting phosphorus fertilizer into a soil. Most soils have a very high capacity to absorb phosphate. And so what happens is that if you increase production, you have to keep putting fertilizer in, obviously at reduced rates, to actually maintain production. But over a period of time, what happens is a lot of phosphorus accumulates in the soil. So this is a diagram. I don't want to go in detail of it, but just if you look at the figure on the little bars on the far right-hand side, you can see there that this is data from 1965 to 2007, and you can roughly see that cumulative P inputs for the world was basically about 550 kilos, and the outtake, that's the went into plants and animal produce, was about 250. So around about half, less than half of the phosphorus that has been put on over that period of time is still sitting in the soil. It varies depending on different areas, so 18 to 65%. The mean is about, the phosphorus use efficiency is about a mean of about 45%. That means that 45% of the fertilizer that's put on in any one growing season, at the beginning of, or during one growing season, is actually used by plants in the growing season, which means that 65% is, 55% is left behind. That is legacy soil phosphorus. That is a big quantum of the phosphorus that's been applied. But coming back to that accumulation of phosphorus, but also this tendency or this practice to push beyond what I would call the agronomic optimum, it has consequences, because the more phosphorus you put in, the more likelihood you are to get leakage, if you like, or loss in drainage, or transfer to water bodies in drainage. And that's what the diagram on the right hand side is basically. As you put more phosphorus, as you raise the phosphorus status, you're going to get more phosphorus in drainage water, which leads ultimately to and contributes to enhanced eutrophication. So those are the issues and backgrounding phosphorus. So basically, we need to do something about improving phosphorus use efficiency, because we've got this large reserve of phosphorus that has accumulated in the soil. We know there are consequences for that. But last slide, Dominic. Thank you. But there are other things. Now, this is a terrible slide. It's just a whole lot of judgment, but I'll explain it to you. The other factor that comes in here is that since I mentioned 2007, 2008, prior to that, things were pretty stable in terms of prices. This diagram, I say in detail, shows the volatility that's happened since 2007, 2008. The top lines are the actual fertilizers. The black line on the bottom is actually the phosphate rock. And you can see that around 2007 and 8, if you look detail there, it went up from less than $50 a ton to over $400 a ton in a very, very short period of time. So what you've got is the raw material has increased in price, and it's got a lot more volatile. And there's all sorts of reasons why things have happened, including towards the right-hand side of this diagram, the invasion, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Has even impacted phosphorus fertilizer prices. So there's a number of reasons why we need to improve phosphorus use efficiency. So hopefully I've given you a little bit of an insight into that. And the last slide, sorry, Dominic, I forgot I had another slide. Yeah. And so just there's a bit of a summary from Jim Elsers and Phil Hagar's marvelous book on phosphorus that was published a few years ago. So we need to improve phosphorus use efficiency. We need to tighten phosphorus cycles, and we need to look at recovery and reuse. But one of the things that we can do to improve phosphorus use efficiency is to optimize the utilization of phosphorus inputs. It's not stop phosphorus inputs. We can do a little bit of that. We're still going to need phosphorus in a lot of systems, but optimizing utilization of phosphorus. And one of the ways we can do that is to look at what we do with fertilizers, for example. So that leads us nicely into Pietro's talk, hopefully. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Leo. Just a reminder to everyone that we'll be taking questions for Leo at the end of the next presentation. So if you've got any questions on soil use and management or anything that Leo's talked about in terms of phosphorus, please pop them in the questions box. Pietro, you can start sharing your screen while I introduce you. So I'd now like to introduce you to our second presenter, Pietro Sica. Pietro holds a BSc in agronomic engineering from the University of Sao Paulo, an MSc in sustainable agriculture from the University of Padova, and an MSc in crop and soil science from the University of Georgia. He earned his PhD in soil quality from the University of Copenhagen, where he also completed a postdoc focusing on phosphorus use efficiency from byproducts and residues under the guidance of Jakob Majid and Dorrit Muller-Stover. Currently, he's professor at the College of Agriculture at the University of Sao Paulo, specialising in sugarcane quality and industrial processing. So over to you, Pietro.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Lizzie. And also thank you, Leo, for introducing the topic on phosphorus and for inviting me to present here today. I'll start saying that I'm sorry because I was a bit sick in the last couple of days, so my voice is not the best, and I may stop to cough sometimes. But I will start with the presentation now. It is a great honor to be invited to make this presentation on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of soil use and management from the British Society of Soil Science. And actually, this paper was invited by the Soil Use and Management to be presented today. And the title that Leo already presented is the Strategic Placement of Mineral and Bio-Based Fertilizer for Optimizing Phosphorus Use Efficiency, a comprehensive review. And this review was actually published very recently, I think a couple of months ago. And it was actually part of the literature review of my PhD thesis that I did at the University of Copenhagen with Dorrit and Jakob as my main supervisors. And also Thomas is a co-author that he was a colleague of mine in the first cycle project at the University of Torino in Italy. So this is just a brief introduction about the authors of the paper. And this is the structure of my presentation. I try to adapt a little bit from the structure of the paper, but it's basically an introduction to show the motivation why we wrote this paper. I'll talk a little bit about placement and some concepts on that. Also show how we can improve bio-based fertilizers. So I'll call bio-based fertilizers from now on as BBF, which basically means bio-based fertilizers. And then some take-home messages on how we can improve phosphorus use efficiency. Starting by the introduction. So it was October 2020, and the world was on lockdown due to COVID. And somehow I found a way to move to Denmark to start my PhD there as part of this European Union project under the Marie Curie grant agreement, the third cycle. And by the time when I started my PhD, the topic was optimizing use and application method of waste and bio-based fertilizers, plant and rhizosphere response to fertilizer placement. So by the time we already had some good knowledge about placement, localized application of phosphorus fertilizers, but then we also missed a little bit more on also looking what was going on in the below ground interactions between the roots and the fertilizers and how to improve the bio-based fertilizers or organic wastes to become more efficient fertilizers compared to mineral fertilizers. So then, I mean, as we all know, I will start with a brief contextualization, but phosphorus is a macronutrient for crops and essential for other living microorganisms. As Leo already introduced, mineral P fertilizers are derived from rock phosphate, which is a non-renewable source. And also the mineral fertilizer prices are fluctuating, and especially in the more recent years, it's increasing quite a lot. And also one thing that is interesting, and not interesting, I don't think it's good, but it happens, it's the P cycle is very imbalanced on global, on regional, continental, and global scale. So if you just think that, for instance, a mineral fertilizer can be produced in China, and then it's going to be transported all the way to Brazil, for example, where it's going to be used in 3,000 kilometers from the ports and transported all the way to the field in Mato Grosso or in the center west of the country to produce soybean. And then the soybean is going to uptake this phosphorus, and then it's going to be transported all the way back to the port. Then it's going to be exported back to China, or in this case, I will talk about the European Union. And then animals in the European Union is going to eat this soybean and take up this phosphorus, and then it's going to come out in the sewage or in the animal-derived wastes, or people will eat this meat, and then the phosphorus will come out in the sewage sludge. So it's just a whole cycle. The phosphorus travels all the world, and then ends up that in the European Union, due to this big animal production, this study by Resena showed that the European Union could meet most of its phosphorus demands with a circular economy approach. And in the case of Denmark, for instance, where I did my PhD, as you can see here in the map, it generates more P in biowaste than its own demands, according to Torse et al. But it still exports quite a lot of phosphorus fertilizer per year. And if you see maps of the OSNP saturation in the European Union, you can see like also in Netherlands and Belgium, some specific places there is quite a lot of animal derived waste generated, and also this brings a lot of phosphorus into the soils. And this phosphorus is not so well or not so efficiently used by the crops. And then it starts accumulating, and over time, as Leo showed, it can end up in groundwaters or even in lakes and causing eutrophication. So by when I started my PhD, what we knew was basically there were several studies by already starting by this guy, G.W. Cook, that he's British. But you see that already in the 40s and 50s, there were a lot of studies like recent advances in fertilizer placement, but this was 70 years ago. So there are many studies showing that just by changing the way we apply the phosphorus, we could, and other fertilizers as well, but we could improve a lot the phosphorus use efficiency. But these were mainly the cases for mineral fertilizers. And when I started in 2020, there was this paper from Camilla Lemming, she was a PhD in my group at the University of Copenhagen. And together with people at ETH Zurich, she tested different, mineral fertilizer placed and mixed, but also sewage sludge and sewage sludge ash. And what she found was basically like in the case of sewage sludge, when applying localized, it of course attracts a lot of roots to the placement zone, contrary to the ash that doesn't attract any roots. But this difference is mainly because sewage sludge has a little bit of soluble phosphorus. So this soluble phosphorus in the placement zone will attract the root growth. But in the case of the ash, that has virtually zero soluble phosphorus, you see that the plant just ignore. But what was surprising is that although it attracts the root growth to the placement zone, this did not show an increase in phosphorus uptake nor in plant growth. And another thing we knew about that was also that some organic fertilizers or some bio-based fertilizer, when placed, according even shown by this work by William Penn, it can cause some ammonia toxicity because some of these materials, like as cattle slurry, or I'll show later with the meat and bone meal, also has a high amount of organic nitrogen. And when placed in the soil, this organic nitrogen is going to be mineralized, and then it's going to release ammonium, and this ammonium is going to be toxic to the plant. So basically, by this time, when I started my PhD in 2020, we knew that for mineral phosphorus fertilizer, the placement was quite effective. I mean, I'll show that it depends, of course, in several factors later. But for organic and bio-based fertilizer, this was not the case. So after 3 years of literature review, a lot of discussions, meetings with the FertCycle group and also with other colleagues working with phosphorus, I was writing the literature review of my PhD thesis, and we got into a point talking with my supervisors on the time that maybe we could transform that into a paper, because we were getting a lot of information and a lot of new things, making some connections and some points that we thought that was really interesting and just by itself could become a strong publication. And we decided to answer a few questions. The first were like, what are the benefits and key factors influencing the placement of phosphorus fertilizers? And under what environmental conditions is this practice most effective? Also, what are the primary constraints limiting the placement of bio-based fertilizers for enhancing phosphorus use efficiency? And what strategies can be employed to mitigate potential negative effects and optimize phosphorus availability in the placement zone of bio-based fertilizers? So if you remember, what we knew by the time was like for mineral fertilizers, it could work quite well. So we wanted to know what were the factors influencing that. We knew that for bio-based fertilizers, it was not working so well. So we wanted to study deeper what were the primary constraints limiting the placement of these bio-based fertilizers. And of course, if we knew the constraints, we also knew how we can improve that and make more efficient bio-based fertilizers. So I'll start a little bit now talking about the placement. So by dictionaries, Oxford, for example, dictionary, the definition of placement is the act of putting something in a specific place or the position of something. In this paper, we made our own definition that is basically fertilizer application methods into a specific spot, as you can see here in the pictures, aiming to reduce the contact area of the fertilizer with the soil, using the crop row as a reference position. So we have some images and figures that we prepared during the elaboration of the paper. So we defined the different types of placements that we could find in the literature and homogenize the definition of them. So here I give the first example is broadcast. Broadcast is not a placement, but it's usually a comparative or a reference to compare with the placement. So basically it's when we spread the fertilizer through the soil surface, and afterwards it can be incorporated or not. But we have this placement in the seed row, which basically we place the fertilizer together with the seeds, or as a band placement as well. And this is quite effective as a starter fertilizer. So the crop, when it germinates, it will have access to this fertilizer or to this phosphorus just after in the early season of the early stage of the growing season. Some cases we also see, I've seen some studies in Australia, for instance, that they do the subsurface placement. Because if it's like a tropical area or depending on the season, we can have very dry season. So if you apply in the surface this placement, or if you place the fertilizer in the surface, the soil is going to dry and then the plant's not going to have access to this phosphorus. So the idea is that if you apply in the subsurface, it's going to be less influenced by the variation or the fluctuation of the soil moisture during the season. Another type of placement that can be common, maybe sometimes with the organic fertilizers, is the side roll application, which is usually you apply the fertilizer by 5 to 10 centimeters on the side of the row, just aiming to reduce some toxicity effects. So in Denmark, for instance, sometimes it's quite common to inject cattle slurry or pig slurry. So you can do that a little bit far from the seed row or a few days or a few weeks in advance. So then you can reduce some toxicity effects, as I showed before with ammonium toxicity. And in some cases, for some crops that you can transplant the crop, you can transplant the phosphorus fertilizer together with the crop. So these are some of the types of placements that we identified in the literature. And then we also listed some potential advantages of mineral P fertilizer placement based on some studies in the literature. And the most common to see is that it reduces the contact area between soil and fertilizer. So as Leo already said before in his presentation, one of the main problems or the main limitations of phosphorus is that it can get easily sorbed by other compounds in the soil, mainly aluminum, iron, and calcium, depending on the phosphorus properties. So if you have a mineral fertilizer that is highly soluble and you apply it mixed with the soil, you're just increasing the contact area between the fertilizer and the soil. Then when you place it, you're basically trying to protect it by reducing this contact area. And then you also reduce the amount of fertilizer being sorbed by the soil. It can also provide higher amounts of phosphorus to the plant at earlier stages, as we discussed before. So you're applying the seed row, and then it can act as a starter fertilizer. Phosphates also stimulates root proliferation in the placement zone. So we can also improve the exploration of the phosphorus in this placement zone. Increases P uptake and plant growth with mineral fertilizer. So here we show this image that is basically the plant is having access to this whole bunch of phosphorus here in the early stage compared to the one applied broadcast that the plant doesn't have access to all the phosphorus. And in some studies, we saw that when we apply a soluble fertilizer source, the roots are going going to grow faster in the early stages. So the plant is also going to explore better the soil resources. And also, there are some studies showing that it can give the crop a competitive advantage for phosphorus acquisition against weeds in the interrow. So some people call it a non-chemical weed control method. So you basically apply it close to the seeds, and then the weeds in the interrow will not have access to the fertilizer, or will have access, but then less access than the crop of interest. But all these are for mineral fertilizer. And then we also noticed that there are not many studies on bio-based fertilizers on placement. So we also investigated some of the factors influencing the effectiveness of pea fertilizer placement. One of the main was the soil type. So it will be more responsive in soils with higher pea sorption capacity, like weathered soils, which is basically this idea of reducing the contact area between the soil and the fertilizer in order to reduce the pea sorption by the soil. The labiope in the soil, if it's too high, I mean, the placement is basically when you place a phosphorus fertilizer, you're creating a gradient between the placement zone and the soil. So the bigger this gradient would be better for the plant. But if it's too high, this gradient is not going to be too high. But it's also, if it's too low, it will not have, the crop will have access to this phosphorus in the early stage, but then afterwards will not have enough to grow through the season when it starts exploring the whole soil. So the idea is to have a soil with a build profile of phosphorus that is enough to sustain the plant growth, and then this placement can act as a starter fertilizer to boost crop growth in the early stage. Also, soil moisture. It's like if the soil gets drier, or it will have a lower P diffusion and availability. So as I mentioned before, in tropical or drier regions, subsurface can be an alternative to improve that. Cold temperatures can favor the placement. So if you have early season, like in Denmark, and you want to start your crop, the cold temperature is going to reduce the plant growth and also the root growth. So then it's going to have a slower exploration of the bulk soil. So if you place this fertilizer close to the seeds, already at the early stages, the plant will have access to the phosphorus. So it can also improve. But what we identified as the main difference between the bio-based fertilizers and the mineral fertilizers was basically the type, but mainly the phosphorus solubility of the fertilizers. If you see in this table from the paper, from the article, most of the mineral fertilizers have highly soluble phosphorus. So the water extractable P of the fertilizer will usually be above 70% of the total phosphorus. But then when you see bio-based fertilizers like sewage sludge, is going to be up to 12%. If it's a sewage sludge ash, it's going to be up to 0.06%, or sewage sludge biochar 0.5%. So you see that these values are quite low compared to mineral P fertilizers. And then it goes back to this paper from Camila Lemming that was the opportunity costs for maize associated with localized application of sewage sludge derived fertilizers, as indicated by early roots and phosphorus uptake response. So basically, like what they saw in this paper is that some bio-based fertilizers may have enough soluble P to attract root growth in the placement zone. However, it will not be enough to sustain plant growth through the season. So this is going to create an opportunity cost, allocating the carbon to grow root in the placement zone instead of exploring the bulk soil resources. So the plant is going to find this little amount of soluble phosphorus in the placement zone that it's higher than in the soil. And then we'll stop there and start proliferating roots to explore this phosphorus resource because of the root plasticity. But then when the plant realizes it's stopped exploring the soil and then it's focused on exploring this placement zone, but this placement zone will not have enough phosphorus, available phosphorus for the plant to grow. So afterwards, it will create this opportunity cost in there. And in another paper, I'm going to pass quickly here, but Berno et al., that it's also from our group at the University of Copenhagen, she compared, for example, a sewage sludge with sewage sludge biochar In the case of biochar, it has virtually zero soluble P. And as you can see here in terms of labile P, phosphatase activity, and pH changes, there was almost no response from the roots or from the plants or from the microbial community in the soil. So basically, when it's a biochar or a ash, which are incinerated materials that has virtually zero soluble phosphorus, this response is even smaller or even less significant because it basically creates an inert zone in the soil. And Raymond et al. And Miller-Stover et al. Also show that when you have ashes or biochar with zero or with little soluble P, if you mix with the soil, you are going to increase the contact area between the soil and the fertilizer, which can facilitate the process and then increase the reaction between the fertilizer and the soil. So mixing it with the soil can also favor that. So in this case, there is not also very recommended to place a material with almost no soluble phosphorus. And then we went to the part of my PhD that was to improve the bio-based fertilizer for placement. And our hypothesis was that for the placement of bio-based fertilizer to be more efficient, pre-treatments to increase the P that is readily available in the rhizosphere may be needed, benefiting plant response and growth in early stages. So briefly and quickly, we tested different materials and different treatments to solubilize the phosphorus in these materials. So we tested acidification with sulfuric acid, organic acid, bioacidification, NaOH treatment, but we saw basically that the sulfuric acid was the one working the best at the time. And here I show some examples. So these are some images with DGT, with this diffusive gradient in thin films gels that basically we put in the soil, and then it's gonna absorb the phosphorus, and then we put in ammonium molybdate solution, and we see how much phosphorus it's uptaking. So if you see here in the digestate solid fraction, when it is untreated, most of the labile P remains in the placement zone. And when we acidified, so much phosphorus went and moved away from the placement zone that the gel that we applied even saturated. For the meat and bone meal, that is another bio-based fertilizer, we saw a similar trend for the untreated material. So you see that most of the labile P remained in the placement zone, but then when we acidified, this labile P zone expanded significantly. And then you see here in red that it's a really high concentration of labile P that was absorbed by the gel. But even like after this was a couple of weeks, we had 3 to 5 centimeters of phosphorus moving away from the placement zone. So you can see that it really increased considerably. And just showing some results. I'm showing the picture here, but we also have in this paper the results, and you can see there. But basically, we had the digestate solid fraction acidified and placed, which is this big onion here. And you can see compared to the untreated place, how much it increased in terms of yield, but also in terms of phosphorus uptake and other parameters. And it was even better, I mean, slightly better than the TSP by the time. And in the case of the meat and bone meal, it also improved a little bit a lot compared to the untreated placed, and a little bit compared to the untreated mixed. I'll go quickly through this because I think I'm reaching my time. But another thing that we noticed is that here I'm comparing the digestate solid fraction, which doesn't have a lot of nitrogen. But the meat and bone meal that we applied had around 10% of nitrogen and 4% of phosphorus. So you see that when we applied in the soil, it was always creating this ammonium toxicity zone here, and the roots had no access to the placement zone. So you see a typical symptom of ammonium toxicity, that is this brownish or dark root tip, which was collected basically here, right next to this placement zone. So what we saw is that the plant, this ammonium toxicity was creating a barrier for the plant to have access to the phosphorus in the fertilizer in the placement zone. So if you see here, in the case of the untreated, the ammonium toxicity zone was much larger than the phosphorus diffusion. But when we acidified, the phosphorus diffusion was going further and leaving or being diffusing greater distances than these ammonium toxicity zones. And then using 33P in this work, these are two different kinds of methane bone meal. You see, like when we place the methane bone meal in gray, it's the P derived from the fertilizer. It was really low when it was placed. But then when we acidified and placed, it significantly increased the P uptake from the fertilizer. And in case of methane bone meal pellets, you see that it's almost zero here, the placed methane bone meal pellets. But when we acidify, it increased it by several times and was much better. So basically, by acidifying, we can make the phosphorus diffuse further and also reduce this toxicity effect from the ammonium. And now I'm gonna give some take-home messages. So in the case of mineral phosphorus fertilizer that are more soluble, it can be effective, the placement, because it reduces the soil contact with the fertilizer and can increase the early stage phosphorus availability. It can also enhance root growth and yield and reduce weed competition. But success will depend on soil properties, placement methods, phosphorus solubility, and other factors that we discussed here before. And bio-based fertilizers with low solubility, it may cause ammonium toxicity effect due to the high nitrogen-phosphorus ratio. Acidification may improve phosphorus solubility and reduces toxicity. I didn't show here much, but we also see that placing these fertilizers, bio-based fertilizers with high nitrogen, a bit further from the row or even before, a couple of weeks before, a few days before seeding, can also reduce this toxicity effect. So this is also a strategy. And the placement of mineral P fertilizers is quite well studied and can improve the use efficiency. Should be aligned with the 4R nutrient stewardship. So it should be in the right time, as we discussed before, right place. As I showed, there are different types of placement, right source, and also, of course, at the right rate, especially of soluble phosphorus. And the efficiency will depend on several factors. So more research is needed to do that. And sometimes we also need to look at below ground and see what's going on in the interactions between the roots, between the fertilizer, the placement zone, the soil microorganisms, and other factors that may affect this phosphorus availability. And in the case of bio-based fertilizers, at least for some specific bio-based fertilizers, we saw that some pre-treatments may be needed. I didn't mention here, but we tried, for instance, to acidify wood sludge, and then it becomes too toxic to the plant. So it is really dependent on the type of material and also the type of treatment. And key takeaway, optimizing bio-based fertilizer placement unlocks the full potential, ensuring sustainable and productive agriculture, reducing the dependence on external inputs. So I would like to thank you very much. I'm sorry because of my voice. It's not in the best of my days, but if you have any questions, I think we'll start the session now, and I'll be happy to answer. And here I leave my LinkedIn in case you want to connect and follow there. But thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Pietro. And I thought your voice held out very well. Don't worry. Yeah, thank you for that. I'd like to now invite Leo to also join us on the screen. We'll move to our Q&A session. So we've had a few questions through. I know Leo's answered a few of them in the chat already, but I think we will go back through them for the benefit also of anyone that might be watching back on YouTube and won't see the Q&As. So first question for you, Leo. Your slide suggested that most phosphorus is sourced from rock. What impact might this have as net zero objectives increasingly impact global food supply chains? That was from Diana.
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think it's going to be hard to attain net zero with regards to phosphorus, but as I indicated in my slides, there's a lot we can do in terms of phosphorus moving around the world. There's a lot of concentration of phosphorus, for example, in urban areas, right, where most people live in the world. There's a lot of potential to actually recover and reuse that phosphorus. It's not perfect. It needs a lot of work. But for example, you can recover from liquid sewage, or even treated sewage. You can recover things like struvite, and struvite has been proven to be a very, very effective fertilizer, surprisingly good actually. And that can also be from industrial waste as well. So I think that the part of there's a whole suite of things that we can do to actually tighten the cycle as well. But there's one thing I also want to mention in this is, and I didn't get a chance to do it, is a lot of what I was talking about was kind of, it's not Western, but it's developed and emerging economies like, Western Europe, North America, China, Brazil, Argentina, for example, and India. There's a whole lot of the world there, and it was in that diagram, which is in an opposite situation where they don't have any phosphorus and they don't have access to phosphorus. And in fact, in those systems, the phosphorus use efficiency, and there's many ways of measuring it, is actually very good because they're actually mining the phosphorus that's in the soil. So that's an when you consider something like net zero, you've got to consider that there are large parts of the world that are actually very, very deficient in phosphorus, and they present their own challenges as well in terms of very high phosphate retention fixation capacities, which presents a considerable challenge for increasing phosphorus availability. So a bit of a long-winded answer, but I actually answered another question as well, I think. Yeah.
That's great. Pietro, it's a big topic. Did you want to chip in there as well?
Sorry, I missed the.
Sorry, it was about net zero and phosphorus use. I didn't. Leo sort of provided a fairly comprehensive answer. I just wanted to check with you whether you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, no, I agree with Leo because especially here in Brazil, we are still quite dependent on phosphorus sources. In my opinion, I mean, based on what I saw during my time at the European Union, I think the ideal is try to make a better balance globally. Because for me, it's still, as I started with my presentation, it just doesn't make sense to have this whole phosphorus being imported by Brazil, coming all the way 3,000 kilometers from the port here to produce animal feed, to then be sent back or to China or to European Union. So I just think that we need to make shorter this transportation of phosphorus.
Yeah,
I couldn't agree more. Yep.
Good points. Okay, we've got another question here. It was directed at you, Leo, but again, Pietro, you can chip in as well. How can we enhance phosphorus use efficiency in ultrasols and oxasols, as these soils have high amounts of iron and aluminium, contributing to low efficiency of phosphorus?
Yeah, well, that is a massive challenge. But I mean, yeah. I mean, this is the big challenge, and a lot of what I was talking about before there is a lot of these. We call it the global south. That's what people. That's the terminology. We'll use that terminology. A lot of the rapid expansion in population. The phosphorus is not getting there, right? It's desperately required. But the problem is that if you put fertilizer in there, soluble fertilizer, it's virtually sucked up. It's fixed, right? And that's a very difficult process to reverse. But there is hope on the horizon. And actually, some of the work out of University of Sao Paulo, done in collaboration with Bangor University in the UK, there's a recent bit of work that was just published a few years ago, I think, showed that there are plants that have an ability, a unique ability to access that very stable phosphorus. And they may not be food plants, but they can be used as green manures. I don't call them cover crops. They're using them as green manures. So what you're doing is you can possibly, if we can find more plants, I can't remember, it's Brachiaria is the name of the plant, I think, from memory. And the thing about it is, if you can put these plants into the cropping system as a short-term thing, we've got lots of evidence that can actually, possibly improve the use of phosphorus, both newly applied phosphorus and also phosphorus that's been applied previously. But that's one thing. There's a major challenge there. I mean, I'm very skeptical, and I'm afraid of you, but I'm extremely skeptical of microbial inoculants and phosphate solubilizing bacteria. And there's a very good article just been, a commentary article just been published in Plant and Soil, which is quite scathing on, to be honest, on that, and it makes a lot of sense. I don't think there are easy solutions to that. I mean, I'll let Pietro, he's probably more familiar than me with that topic, but yeah.
Yeah, so what I know here from Brazil is that one way of doing this, first you need to monitor your area for the available phosphorus. Here in Brazil we use ResNP, and in Europe I know it's also NP, but basically when we open a new area or we start a new agricultural area here in Brazil, it takes a few years for you, we say, to build a good phosphorus profile in the soil. So if you have an oxy soil, you need to make sure that you will start saturating a bit of this aluminum and iron in the soil with the phosphorus, so that you can have a good or acceptable background, available phosphorus in the background. And after that, you can start doing this localized application or band application of phosphorus. So with that, you can ensure that the plant will have access to the phosphorus at the early stages as a starter fertilizer to boost plant growth, and then also make sure that the plant will have at least a good background of phosphorus in the surrounding soil or in the bulk soil, and that can explore that better. I agree with Leo regarding the phosphorus solubilizing bacteria. We've done some studies, as I showed, with acidification, and sometimes we need a very low pH in order to solubilize the phosphorus, which I really doubt that the bacteria can do that. And we tried with organic acids, we tried with bioacidification, and we see that, yeah, it's really hard to solubilize a phosphorus. So, but it is a market growing in Brazil. I don't know what happens quite well, but I see some works that it might be more some plant growth promoters that can help the roots to explore better the soil resources rather than solubilizing phosphorus. But I think the ideal, at least what I see here in Brazil, is to monitor your area and make sure that you have a good profile of phosphorus in your soil. And then you can start placing with these strategies of placing phosphorus and make a more precise supply of phosphorus according to the crop demand.
Okay, thank you both. We've had a question from Thomas in the UK about interactions between sulfur and phosphorus. His question was, what do you think about applying sulfur and increasing concentration levels here in the UK soils that are high in phosphorus to increase absorbing rates in grassland and cropping land? Now, Leo, I know you've commented that you weren't familiar with that approach, but I didn't know whether either of you had any more general comments on interactions.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think the question, the reason why I feel it's been answered, but I probably shouldn't have answered because it's not really. The only thing I can think about is that we sulfate is the idea. I think the idea is that you add the sulfate and the sulfate displaces the phosphate. I think that's the idea. That's new news to me. Because phosphate is very specific. Among the three main anions, the molecular anions that drive the phosphate, sulfate, and nitrate. Nitrate isn't only absorbed on very acid soils with very high levels of oxide, and that's why nitrate is such a problem. Phosphate is very strongly absorbed on many soils, the only exceptions being very low P retention, sort of sandy soils, whatever, with very low levels of oxide. I'm not familiar with sulfate absorption. In New Zealand, the only time we see significant sulfate absorption is in volcanic ash soils. These are very high P retention soils, and they retain some sulfate there. But I'm not aware of any displacement. If maybe I'm misunderstanding the question, but yeah, I don't know. Sorry, Pietro. Yeah.
No, I don't know if it's related to the question, but what I've read a little bit during my PhD is that there was some better filtering in the industry, so there was a reduced volume of acid rains, and with that there was a reduced amount of sulfate being deposited in agriculture fields. And then in some areas, in some regions, it became having more frequent sulfur deficiency in crops. And then they started recommending to apply more sulfur. And that's also some of the idea we had with the acidification with sulfuric acid. It's to apply the sulfur together with the phosphorus. But I'm not sure if the question was related to that, but I know that, of course, if you have the sulfur limiting your plant growth, then the plant's not going to take the phosphorus. Then if you can supplement sulfur to the crop is going to grow better and uptake more phosphorus. But
yeah.
Just add one thing to that. We've always had sulfur here. Sulfur is just in New Zealand, certainly in pastoral systems. Sulfur fertilizer is just as important as phosphorus. It's always been there. The thing about sulfur is it's a bit like nitrogen. It's almost, in most of certainly our agricultural soils, it's controlled by biology. It's biology that controls sulfur availability, and that makes it actually quite a difficult nutrient to actually manage in terms of assessing its availability as well. But I take your point about the sulfur levels. That's because the heavy industries have moved off, and you know, and the sulfur levels have gone on. Yeah.
Thank you both. I'm going to move on now. I've got a question from Audrey, who's asked, I understand that phosphorus availability from ash and some other bio-based fertilizers is often very low, but how much does that matter where these materials are being applied to soils that are already at target P index or P status? She said, surely the P availability in fertilizer is much more important where extractable phosphorus concentrations are below the target for the crops in a particular rotation.
yeah,
Who wants to take
Do
that?
you want me to take that, or Pietro, you want to take that?
No,
You're the bio-based man.
No, I think that's a good discussion, because before coming to Brazil, I had a successful grant to further investigate phosphorus availability especially in biochar, in phosphorus-rich biochar, because I think it's important to see not only the short-term availability, but also in the medium term and the long term. So if I understand the question well, it's like if you have the soil with already with available or phosphorus status according to what you want for your crop, what is the point? I mean, it doesn't matter if you apply more phosphorus with ash that is not that available. But I think like in the long term, you may accumulate that phosphorus, and also depending on the soil, we see that this interaction between the ashes and the biochar can actually release the phosphorus, maybe not in a short term, but in a medium term. So I think it's also something that it should be better studied in long-term field trials or something like that. Maybe it got a bit confusing, but
yeah. Okay, thank you both. We'll move on to a question from Tamar, who said, here in Egypt, for alkaline soils, acidification may be of interest to improve phosphorus availability. I wonder how it could be for acidic soil where aluminium and iron reduce the availability.
so this is also a good question, because of course, when you think about acidifying these biomaterials, you think that of course we are going to acidify the soil. But the idea is that we are not acidifying these in an extent that it's going to affect the whole or the bulk soil. It's more like a localized application. And in some cases, even in Denmark, like slurry, it's already acidified to reduce ammonia emissions during storage. So it is something, of course, that over time can reduce or can acidify a little bit the soil. But the idea is to do this localized application is to reduce this effect in the bulk soil.
Okay, thank you. We've got a few more questions coming in. I'm just going to take, I know we've just slightly gone over, but I'm going to take two more before we close the webinar. So first of all, we've got a question from Salim, who's asking about whether there's a maximum value of phosphorus, either total or available, that we should not exceed to avoid toxicity to plants. So going the other way with maximum values.
Yeah, I've never heard of phosphorus toxicity. I mean, I am aware that I'm vaguely aware of some plants that are sensitive to phosphorus. There are plants, for example, that are evolved to live in very, very low phosphorus environments, and if you feed them phosphorus, if you give them phosphorus, they literally don't like it. some of these plants in the places like Western Australia and South Africa, in very, very old landscapes. I don't think you're talking about. I don't think there are maximum levels. I mean, I go back to the thing that about the agronomic optima, about working within agronomic optima. That's don't over when I was starting out on phosphorus, there was sort of talk about you can never have enough phosphorus, right? Phosphorus doesn't move. Phosphorus isn't lost. Nobody ever looked at chronosequence studies, and chronosequence studies have been going on, since the 1960s, and they show that long term, most phosphorus actually, the biggest loss, if you've got no inputs to a system, the biggest loss of phosphorus is in drainage. Phosphorus does move, and we know that and I alluded to it in one of my slides there, that it's common sense, it's just basic chemistry. If you put more and more of phosphorus into a soil, then the likelihood or the occurrence of the concentration of phosphorus in the solution increases, and therefore, if that gets moved by drainage, it's going to increase the phosphorus loss or the transfer. And we know that it doesn't take a lot of phosphorus to make a big difference. When we look at nitrogen losses, they're talking maybe 10, 15, 20 kilos or whatever, even more than that. Phosphorus, you might be talking less than 1 kilo, but in a fertilized environment, but in a control environment, you might be talking about 0.1, 0.2. A very small difference between that. And I think that agronomic optima, I mean, year on year, you're never going to get the same picture. So if you stay below that optimum, the plants will get enough. They will get enough, right? And there's other things that are determining the productivity. So don't put too much on. Use it sparingly. It's yeah.
Good advice.
But the other thing about phosphorus, just to mention that, is that there was a lot of talk, there was a lot of debate after that big spike, and there's a whole story there's a whole seminar series you could give on what happened in 2000, 2007 and 8 when you had that catastrophic increase in phosphorus price. It was a great shock, but it was actually I say it was one of the best things for phosphorus research because it actually focused our attention on that issue. And there was talk then about us running out of phosphorus and available phosphorus, etc. I think that's been sort of reevaluated because when the cost of phosphate rock, when the price of it increases, there are lots of deposits that become economic, right? That are uneconomic at low levels. There was even a deposit here in New Zealand where there's something like 20 million, I don't know, anyway, some millions of tons of very, very available phosphorite material just off the coast here, just where I am, right? But it's it's uneconomic. We know it's there. We know it's really good. It's the lowest cadmium phosphate rock that's been found. It's very reactive. It doesn't have to be acidified to work. But the issue was it's just not commercially viable. That became commercially viable, when those things. And also there's been supposedly this massive phosphorus deposit being found in Norway, which is going to change. Which is apparently it's colossal. So we're not going to run out of phosphorus anytime soon, I don't think. But we've got to use it. We've got to learn from the past 60, 70 years and treat it with respect. And remember that half of the world that doesn't have any phosphorus, that's desperately short of phosphorus as well. So I'll stop there. Stop preaching.
Thank you. Good advice to sort of end the discussion on phosphorus, because the final question I'm going to put to you is slightly broader and a nice one to finish on. And Leo, you in particular might be able to comment in terms of what you've seen coming through on the journal. But Diana has asked, how are we using AI to advance our academic studies in soil science? So I don't know whether either of you want to comment on that.
Oh, do you want
I think although I'm young, I'm not a big I don't know a lot about AI, to be honest. I'm not a big
Me neither.
user.
So should we pass to Leo?
No, yeah, okay, but I'll just deflect it somewhere else. I mean, I'm slightly confused by AI, but I kind of think of it as just advanced computing. It's just computing moving on at a different level. But there is I think there's a it's either a review, a Russell review paper. I think somebody's just put it up on the chat.
Dom's just put
There's
it in the chat. Yeah.
a Russell review, I think, that's come out in EGSS about AI in soil science there. So I think it's yeah. I mean, I don't want to comment on. I'm going to go with Pietro on this. I mean, I think in one hand it's exciting, and the other hand it's frightening. I mean, as an academic, it frightens the hell out of me because all we're dealing with is cheating. That's the whole talk is all about. Basically, people, using this technology rather than to not good ends. Let's just put it that way. I think there's lots of great uses for it, but yeah.
I think that
So the comments
paper,
gone in there. Go and look at the latest issue of European Journal of Soil Science. Yeah.
yeah, so that would be a good one to look at if you're interested in
Yep.
that.
Yep.
Thank you both very much. I'm going to draw the Q&A to an end now, and on behalf of the British Society of Soil Science, I want to express our thanks to you both today for coming along to present, and thank you to everyone else who's joined us for attending. When you leave, you'll find a quick feedback survey, which will help you take the time to complete. Also to note, as I said at the beginning, the recording of the webinar will be available after the event on the YouTube channel. Our next Zoom into Soil webinar is planned for Wednesday, the 7th of May. We don't have details yet, but keep an eye out on the webpage if you follow us on socials for more information. So I hope to see you at future events. And in the meantime, thank you all very much and goodbye.